And the answer is if you give it to charity, you actually don't have to pay any tax on that
On the
that
gain.
gain that happened in that account. Hi, Meg.
Good afternoon, Scott.
Welcome to another episode of Real Personal Finance. Today, we are going to talk about a very exciting account, right, Meg?
It is remarkably sexy in the eyes of many a client and other person in the tech industry that I know.
Yes. And of course, we're talking about donor advised funds.
Of course. What
Of
else
course.
would you think of after the word sexy?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm sure someone at a symphony somewhere is very excited talking about donor advised funds. But we see the use case for them in our practices.
Mhm.
A lot of families come to us and are curious about them. They want to know, like, what are these things? How do they work?
Yep,
When should I be thinking about using them? What are the
exactly.
drawbacks? So let's just take some time and walk through how we think about them and how people at home can frame them in their own lives.
Yeah. As you just mentioned, I have had a lot of clients come to me with the phrase donor advised fund,
Right.
and that's sort of all they know.
Yes, exactly.
But they've heard about it in their colleagues or in tech industry media of some sort, and it's hot and it's sexy and it's what rich people do. Um, what is it?
Yeah.
And functionally, it is just an easier way to implement tax efficient charitable giving. That's
Yeah.
how I think of the donor advised fund.
No, that's exactly what it is. But and when you kind of said it's what the rich people do, like
Yeah.
yeah, I put in
Finger
quotes the
quotes.
rich
Yeah.
people, but like before donor advised funds, if you wanted to give in a very streamlined way as a family, you had to set up this thing called a family foundation, where you basically created this 501c3 to put money in to give money away, and you had to have your tax return done and all these things, all these like really, really big, complex
Yeah,
systems
and
needed to
expensive to
exist
implement.
to do that. And then along the way, donor advised funds were created, and donor advised funds are essentially the same thing, just a much simpler version.
Mhm.
And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yes. And I used to poo-poo donor advised funds. I think
Really?
yes, I have been converted. Uh, but I think largely because you might remember a few years ago, there was an article, and I don't know whether it's in tech industry media or is just, mainstream media like the New York Times about the tech industry, but that donor advised funds were so popular among all these incredibly wealthy people in tech. So they shoveled all this money into these donor advised funds and then never gave any of it to charity.
Oh,
Right?
yeah.
And it was a very popular article. I wish I could remember even the publication, let alone the title of the article. But that's what made me so negative about it for so
Hmm.
long, because the whole point of giving to charity is to actually give to charity.
Right.
To
So in your view, they were giving for a tax benefit, not for a more altruistic or a
not
charitable
to actually help
benefit.
organizations, causes, people
Yeah.
who deserve their help. Yeah.
Yeah. But we'll
But I
talk
have
about planning, because
mhm,
you
mhm,
should plan on how you're going to give. Hmm.
yes. So let's talk about the way that people normally give to charity.
Yeah.
For example,
Normally they just use a check or a credit card. Well, I
ri
should say check. They give cash.
haha, yes.
They almost always give a credit card. It basically out of your own cash flow comes cash through either a credit card payment or something, and you just give to charity.
Right, and you
Yeah.
set it up and, it's got the merit of credit cards. You can set up the recurring monthly payment. You set it up once, you never have to think about it again.
Hmm.
Great, without making an effort, you're continually giving to causes that you care about, and there
Yeah.
is real merit in that approach. Again, if the overriding purpose is to get money to causes you care about, that accomplishes that very easily. Alright, so that's
I
the
s-
norm. Yeah.
we and oh, just to be clear, like one of the things
Yes.
that we'll look at is we'll just look at like your tax return, and we'll just look for those itemized expenses and see, like, are you giving consistently over the years? And if you are, how much are you giving? And that's one of the markers of, like, does a donor advised fund make sense for you, or could it? And one of the questions to start with is like, do you give to begin with? Because to your point, Meg, you made earlier, if you're just doing it for a tax reason and you're not trying to give, it's not going to be that beneficial for you in the end.
Right. You give away $1 to get a 40% tax deduction, you're still out 60 cents. So
Exactly.
since we've just sort of established what the average way is of giving to charity, and a donor advised fund is more complicated. It requires more effort to set this up than just setting up a recurring monthly credit card donation.
Yeah.
So I would love to talk about when donor advised funds are particularly helpful, when it would actually be worth your while to go to the extra effort of setting it up instead of just sticking with your, 15 monthly credit card recurring donations.
Yeah, and let's just look at it from a really simple standpoint too, right? So the money that you're giving, the money that you're giving through your credit card bills, credit card statement, you're just using after tax money to make a contribution to a charity, which is really nice. And if you're in a certain tax brackets, or pardon me, I shouldn't say tax brackets, but if you have if you itemize your deductions, that charitable contribution is going to be a bit of a write-off. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes,
Yeah.
if you itemize your
If you
deductions.
itemize your deductions. If you don't itemize your deductions, it's not actually a tax benefit that those
Right.
folks in Silicon Valley are trying to get. Now, let's say that you have a choice of, okay, I'm going to give that cash, but maybe over here, in another little bucket of your balance sheet, maybe you bought Apple stock before the iPod came out, right? And so, like, you have one share that's not, I don't even know how many tens of thousands of dollars it would be worth, like with all the
Right.
splits and stuff, but it would be a huge gain
Right.
since the 2007. And the question is, well, what if I just gave that to charity? Um, would I have to pay taxes when I give that to charity? Because I bought it for such a small dollar amount and I'm giving it away at such a big dollar amount. And the answer is, if you give it to charity, you actually don't have to pay any tax on that
On the
that
gain.
gain that happened in that account. So it can actually be a really efficient thing to give to a charitable organization.
Right.
But you might
So
not wanna give that big dollar amount to them. You might wanna just give them that little tiny payments that you're making throughout the year.
mhm,
So, how could a donor advised fund be helpful there, Meg?
sure. Well, what you were describing with your Apple example was what we would call an appreciated security.
Mhm.
Most often that just means a stock that has gained value
Yeah.
since you acquired it. Maybe you bought Apple back in 2004, maybe you had an RSU vest 3 years ago and just kept that share, and
Mhm.
has grown since then, and you have owned it for at least 1 year. Both of those things need to be true.
Yep.
Um, yeah, so let's say you have 1 share of stock that is worth $1,000 and you wanna give $400 to a charity, to your point, Scott. You could donate this 1 share of stock to a donor advised fund. That is the charitable donation from a tax perspective. So now you have 1 share worth $1,000 in this donor advised fund where you can now sell it and turn it into $1,000 worth of cash. But because it's in that donor advised fund wrapper or bucket or account, you don't have to pay taxes on any gains when you sell it. Had
Yeah.
you sold it before you donated, you would have had to pay taxes on the gain. So
Yes.
now you've got $1,000 of cash inside the donor advised fund, and you can just meter out that $1,000 of cash in whatever increments you want to the charities.
Yes.
So that's one way in which a donor advised fund makes it easier to make tax efficient contributions.
Yeah, so donating appreciated stocks can make a lot of sense. There's actually even it kind of goes probably beyond the core work that we do is with people in stock compensation. So
Mhm.
donating low basis, meaning lowest share price, the highest gain stock with its
Highest
long-term
percentage
capital
gain
gain.
stock, yeah.
That's probably the stuff that we're looking at giving in these instances, because that's what makes the most sense to give. But you can actually give other things too. You can give parts of businesses. You can give all kinds of assets that have
Stock in private
appreciation built
companies
in them.
sometimes. Stock in private
Exactly.
companies sometimes. Yep,
Hmm.
yeah, I
Exactly.
just don't deal with that really ever.
Nor do I. But
Yeah,
just know it. You can. So it's something you can look at if you're one of those people. But yeah, what you see is it's a lovely way to give efficiently, because like maybe to the example you were giving before, maybe someone's sending cash donations to 15 different places on a monthly basis.
mhm.
But it's way more efficient for them to give stock, because it'll be
Tax
more
efficient.
efficient, tax efficient for them to
Mhm,
give stock, because it'll just help them save in taxes, and they don't have to pay taxes on the sale of the stock that they wanted to give.
mhm,
But it would be cumbersome to send that appreciated stock to 15 different places. Well, now
yeah.
we can put it in the donor advised fund, and we can send out from one place, just send cash to the 15 places.
Right. You go through the administrative hassle of donating your appreciated security, your stock. You go through that hassle one time, and
Yeah.
you donate it all to your donor advised fund.
Hmm.
That's the end of the hassle, and now you can just distribute the money from the donor advised fund to the charities really easily. And I will
Yeah.
say one other way in which it makes that process easier is some charities, the smaller, almost mom and pop charities, aren't set up to receive appreciated securities. Now,
Hmm.
for example, my alma mater is Wellesley College. Wellesley College is absolutely set up to receive contributions of appreciated securities.
Yeah.
They know what side their bread is buttered on, um, and so I could give appreciated securities directly to Wellesley. I can't give appreciated securities to some of the charities I want to support. I
Sure.
can give cash, however, and so
Right.
I give the appreciated security to the DAF. I turn it into cash inside the DAF, which does not create any tax bill for me, and then I can grant the cash to these smaller sort of mom and pop charities.
Right. Yeah. The smaller mom and popish they are, the more likely they are to just accept cash. So it's a wonderful way to give. How about we now, if we frame it to maybe that we like the idea of donor advised funds, we're thinking, yep, we might have some stock we could appreciate
Mhm.
stock we could put in there. Um, when does it make sense to do this? I think is another
Yes.
important question.
From a tax optimizing perspective, because from a
Hmm.
charitable perspective, I think the answer is always and as frequently as possible to give money to causes you care about. But purely from a tax optimizing perspective, if you are having an unusually high income and therefore high tax rate year, and in our worlds, that is often going to be a year that you go through an IPO and you have a bajillion RSUs vest on IPO day. So no,
Hmm.
you're used to having an annual income of 300,000 or $400,000, and now all of a sudden you have a $1 million income year. Your
Absolutely.
your tax rate just got bumped up several notches.
Right.
And the higher the tax rate, the more you save in taxes on the same dollar of charitable contributions.
Yeah. The more beneficial it is. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's when it's a really good idea to give to charity, sort of regardless of whether you use a donor advised fund or not, right? As long as the money is going to a charity in your high income year, it's a really tax efficient year to give. The benefit of using a donor advised fund is if you're accustomed to giving, three or maybe $5,000 to charity every year, you
Hmm.
probably know where you want your charitable dollars to be going, right? This is
Hmm.
something you've done for a long time. It's not a huge amount of money, so you're not too worried about getting it exactly right. But if all of a sudden you want to give $200,000 to charity, a lot of us are going to step back and say, oh, wait a second. I want to make sure that I'm actually giving this to the right charities.
Right.
Um, but meanwhile, life is going on and I've got this IPO to deal with, and I don't really feel as if I have the capacity to figure that out right now. Oh
Hmm.
my gosh, maybe I just shouldn't give to charity. Well, the beauty of the donor advised fund is that you can actually separate out the tax event, which is donating,
Mhm.
to this donor advised charity. You get the tax benefits in this year, great. But then you can just keep the money in the donor advised fund until you figure out the charities you want to support with that money. So you separate out the donation, the tax event, from the actual giving money to charities. It gives you time while still allowing you to give in the best year for your taxes.
Yeah, it's a great frame. I think, so and just to reiterate what you just said, because a lot of people will, taxes are complicated and giving doesn't make it less complicated, especially to a donor advised fund. So when you actually move funds or stocks or cash or whatever it is from your personal assets into the donor advised fund's in your name. It's just
Mhm,
going to be called, like, ours is the Frank Family Donor Advised Fund, right?
mhm.
It's just now it's sitting in this wrapper that those funds can only be given now to charities. It's that
Yeah,
simple. When the money goes in, when it goes in, that's when the donation happens. That's when the tax benefit happened for me in that moment. When I give funds in the future, there's no tax benefit for me. I'm just giving funds to people. So I could choose to do it all at once, or I could choose to give it over the next 20 years. And there's no difference, right? And it's interesting the way that you were framing it about someone may not know what they want to do with 200,000, is the lens that I'll often give clients when I know what their tax returns are and I know they normally give 5,000 a year, is I'll just come to you, Meg, and be like, Meg, I know you normally give 5,000 a year. This is your big year. So this is a year to stack the donation for a lot of future years.
mhm.
And you might choose to give more in the future, or you might choose to contribute less to your donor advised fund in the future. But this is the year to make that big donation because it's the year we get the biggest tax benefit.
Yep.
So if we know that you want to be giving 5,000 a year for the rest of your life and you're 40, I'm like, okay, you want to be funding for 50 years of giving now. So let's have a conversation about how much we want to put in this year.
Yeah. And on a slightly smaller scale, because I have personally never been through an IPO, so I've never had a year where my income was, 10x what it normally is, or even
Mhm.
5x what it normally is. Uh, but I partially recreate this idea of donating a lot in one year and
Mhm.
less or nothing in subsequent years, and that's what's called bunching
Mhm.
donations.
Mhm.
The point of bunching, the reason why it helps you tax-wise, is that enables you to take advantage of what is currently a really high standard deduction on our taxes
Yeah, this year's
for
29,200.
for married filing jointly.
So a lot of people who have, like, nice homes but not extravagant homes, who have low interest rates on their mortgages from years past and have the $10,000 cap on SALT,
Yes.
which is your state and local
Correct.
taxes,
Mhm.
like, you're probably not getting an itemized deduction anymore,
Right.
right? And
So,
because of
you know
that, Meg's making this point
mm,
that, hey, instead of you giving $5,000 each year, let's have you give 40 in
20,000.
one
Oh, okay.
year,
Yeah.
right? And then not give for 8 or whatever it is, whatever,
Right.
make you get over the threshold of having an itemized deduction. So there's a tax benefit for your giving, but you're not going to do it every other year or something like that.
Yeah. Bunching can get a little I mean, it's a beautiful, like, tax optimizing concept, and it can get a little complicated to understand, but it does boil down to you are milking both the itemized and the standard deductions for all they're worth by donating 4 years worth of money in 1 year and then not donating anything until, for another 3 years.
Right. But it's another place where donor advised funds are really, really helpful because we can do
Exactly.
that and we can keep giving. We can keep giving every year. We're just not getting making the donation every year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
100%. I also think another benefit to donor advised funds, and then we'll touch on the drawbacks.
Mhm.
I think it can be really beneficial for family giving and
Yeah.
introducing kids to
Mhm.
the idea of giving. They can help participate in making donations from the family fund to charities that matter locally.
Yeah, and I'm gonna be a language pedant. They won't be making donations, they'll be making grants.
Oh, pardon me.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I'm being a pedant just because people get it confused all the time.
You're so correct though. You're making a grant because it's in a fund that you're granting to a charity. The
Yeah,
donation already came into the fund. Thank you
yep,
very much, Meg.
you're welcome.
Language
Yeah,
matters.
and this is something I found with my 2 kids. I have, a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, and my husband and I, mostly I, have feelings about where most of our charitable money should go,
Mhm.
but then we have a few $1,000s sort of left at the end of the year, and I'll, gather the girls around the laptop basically and show them how much money we have left and ask them what charities, what causes they really care about and how they'd like to and that they'd like to support, and so we'll divvy it up that way. It's not elaborate at all, but it is exposing them on an annual basis to this is one of the things we do with our money. We
That's
give money
great.
away to causes we agree with.
Love that. What are some other let's talk about some of the drawbacks because it's not all roses and, rainbows. There are fees and admin costs to running these. They're not extravagant, but they do exist. So be aware of them and understand what they are. And the major custodians have donor advised funds. So like Fidelity has one, Schwab has one. There's
Vanguard
the
has one.
Vanguard has one.
Mhm.
So like you can go see which one would you prefer. Some of the times they'll have a minimum balance as well for you have to have a certain amount of funds available or in the account to run it. And they'll have a minimum, initial contribution as well.
Yeah,
So
and
just be
sometimes those
mindful
can
of that.
be yeah, sometimes those can be prohibitive.
Hmm.
I think Vanguard's minimum funding, initial funding is $25,000.
Mm.
I know a lot of people who give meaningfully less than $25,000
Yeah. Yeah,
a
I think
year.
Fidelity's was fairly low back in we used to use Fidelity at my old firm quite a bit, and I've used it for a number of years. I think it might be lower, but,
I
you go find the one that works for you and the user interface that works for you. The thing
yes.
the thing that's nice is that most of those 3 should have already vetted the majority of 501(c)(3)s that you'd be giving to, so more than likely, anyone who you wanna give to is already on their list, and if not, they can help get it on their list pretty quickly because they have to approve the donation. You can't just I can't just say I'm going to give to the 501(c)(3) of Meg and send a check to Meg, right?
Damn it. Yeah.
Which is not legal. Like it actually has to be a real 501(c)(3), which is a kind of a which can in a sense be a drawback. Um, if you're trying to have a donor, you have giving, but you like to do giving with some benefits for yourself. Maybe it's that you have like you want to be a booster of your alma mater, or maybe you want to be. I was listening to public radio on the way in today, and they always talk about the producers club, right, where you get to join the community of people who give to that radio station. Well, you can't get those benefits by giving through a donor advised fund. You can only just give, which is great in and of itself. But if you want those benefits, then giving this way won't be helpful to you. And then I think a final one to think about is some people want to give to people who aren't necessarily charities, but they just want to help
Yes.
people. Maybe it's I
Yes.
want to help a family in my neighborhood who's going through a tough time, or a family who had to deal with some medical issue. You can't get the tax benefits of doing that, but you can certainly give. But you can't use a donor advised fund to do that.
Right. The money in a donor advised fund has to go to what you've been calling a 501(c)(3) charity. And
Yeah,
501(c)(3) is just the part of the tax code that describes this
nonprofits.
yeah. There are charities out there called 501(c)(4)s.
Hmm.
You cannot give money from a donor advised fund to a 501(c)(4). I think a good example is big organizations like the Sierra Club or Planned Parenthood. They've got just a straight up charitable arm, but they also have a political action arm. I think the political
Hmm.
action arm is the 501(c)(4).
Right.
You cannot give money to that arm
Yes.
of the charity.
Hmm.
So when I talk with clients about making charitable contributions, the first thing we do is figure out well, the first thing we do is figure out what causes do you really care about? And the
Hmm.
second step is are these actual 501(c)(3)s that you can get tax benefits from donating to? And sometimes they're not, and that's okay. Give money to them anyways. It's only once you figure out, oh, it's a cause I care about and it's a 501(c)(3). Well, now we can start thinking about tax optimization.
Exactly. Totally agree. And then once the funds are in the donor advised fund, if you know you're going to give it away instantaneously, then, great, give it away. But if you think you're going to maybe do what we talked about earlier, put a lot of money in for giving for the rest of your life, well, then
Mhm.
you can actually invest those funds inside the donor advised fund as well and let them grow so you have more to give in the future. So it's another benefit, but also another component of planning that you want to put in to your charitable strategy.
Yeah. So it reminds me a little bit of having an HSA. You put money
Mhm.
into an HSA, great, you get the tax benefit when you put it in. But now the idea is, when am I going to use this money? If you're going to use it
Exactly.
now, keep it as cash. And personally, that's what my family does. My attitudes on charities is, the sooner I get the money to the charity, the sooner they can decide, knowing everything they do, what's best to do with the money. They can invest it if they want to. But I choose to keep that part simple for me and my family personally.
Yeah.
Um, but I've never given $500,000 to a donor advised fund in a single year. So
Me
that
neither.
might
Maybe
change things.
someday.
Yeah.
Maybe someday. Well, 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 I think we covered everything that good frame for donor advised funds here. Is there anything else that comes to mind for you, Meg?
These are sort of picayune points, but I do see clients getting confused about them.
Mm,
Once you give money to to a donor advised fund, it is not your money anymore. It actually belongs to the charity that is the donor advised fund. You are the donor. You are advising that fund. But the donor advised fund foundation is within its right to deny you any particular use of the money. It's their money at this point. Now,
right.
if you're just doing normal donations to 501(c)(3)s, I have never seen it not go through.
No.
But do keep in mind, this is not your money anymore. You can't take it back out. You do not have ultimate control. You're simply advising. And lastly, I will say that if you start with a donor advised fund and then you decide, you know what, I don't actually like the donor advised fund that this platform offers. I started with the
Mm,
Vanguard donor
yes.
advised fund. I don't really like it. I like Fidelity's donor advised fund better. You can move it.
Yeah, they're portable. Hmm.
Yeah, you can, and it has no tax impact because you're moving money from one 501(c)(3) charity to a different 501(c)(3) charity.
Absolutely. So it's still yours in a sense then. You
Yes.
have
Yeah.
control over where it's going. It's still on your balance sheet, but you don't get to use it for your own consumption. There's no take backs. You have to give it to 501(c)(3)s, is the key. Well, thanks so much for the chat today, Meg, and we'll see you soon.
Okay. Go charitable giving.